gee, I was cool. And when I finally got sober, felt 10 years older, but fuck it, it was something to do. I'm living out in LA. I drive a sports car just to prove I'm a real big baller, cause I made $1 million and I spend it on girls and shoes. But you don't wanna be right like me, never really know a guy like me. You don't ever wanna step off that roller coaster and be all alone. And you don't wanna ride the bus like this, never know who to trust like this. You don't wanna be stuck up on that stage singing, stuck up on that stage singing. I know, sad soul, sad soul, darling. I know, sad soul, sad soul. Took a pill in my pocket, got up, finally got up, got up, 10 years, 10 years. I took a pill in my pocket, got up, finally got up, got up, 10 years, 10 years. Took a pill in my pocket, got up, finally got up, got up, 10 years, 10 years. I took a pill in my pocket, got up, finally got up, got up, 10 years, 10 years. Singer who already blew the shot. I get along with old timers 'cause my name's a reminder of a pop song people forgot. And I can't keep a girl alone, 'cause as soon as the sun comes up, I cut them all loose and worse is my excuse. But the truth is I can't go alone. You don't see high like me, never really know why like me. You don't ever wanna step off that roller coaster and be all alone. And you don't wanna ride the bus like this, never know who to trust like this. You don't wanna be stuck up on that stage singing, stuck up on that stage singing. Oh, I know, my sad souls, sad souls, darling. I know, my sad souls, sad souls. Took a pill in my pocket, got up, finally got up, got up, 10 years, 10 years. I took a pill in my pocket, got up, finally got up, got up, 10 years, 10 years. I took a plane to my home. I brought my pride and my guitar. Well, my friends are all gone, but there's manicures gone, and people still think I'm a star. I walked around downtown.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program is about to begin.
Ladies and gentlemen, our program is about to begin. Please silence your cell phones or place them on vibrate.
أيها السيدات والسادة، سيبدأ البرنامج بعد قليل، لذا نرجو منكم التكرم بالجلوس في مقاعدكم.
Absolutely on the point.
I really enjoyed the environment, enjoyed the topics that they gave us.
Good evening. Welcome to day 4 of WEP 2022. Basically, if you notice, I've been counting down to the end of WEP 2022. But you've heard the technological solutions with regards to food challenges, with regards to human fertility. And right now, for today's this keynote lecture, you're going to hear about something that's close to my heart, which is technological solutions for water and wastewater. So we have here, very glad to have here, Professor Cees Buisman, who is a full professor at the Sub-Department of Environmental Technology at Wageningen University, the Netherlands. His current focal point is on the biorecovery of organics and minerals from waste streams for reuse in industry and agriculture. He combines his full professor position with his position as executive board member at Wetsus, the European Center of Excellence for Sustainable Water Technology. The objective of Wetsus is to create a business-driven international multidisciplinary research program for all aspects of water technology. So he's particularly apt at translating many of the technological solutions developed in lab to magnitude that is needed to make an impact. Professor Buisman is a member of the Netherlands Academy of Engineering and a board member of the many companies and organizations like PAX, Aquatech, Top Sector Water Technology in the Netherlands. So without further delay, let's welcome Professor Cees Buisman for his talk today.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me for your conference. It's a very big honor for me. A resilient world is a beautiful future for the beautiful vision for the future. We live in a world that is shaped more and faster by innovations. But who shapes the innovations? I think very shortly from now, that will be you, because you are trained to become innovators. So what world do you want to create? It's not only about technology, it's also about leadership. So in my presentation today, I want to address these two topics. In the first place, I want to show you the building I'm presenting from. It's the Wetsus building in Leeuwarden, a small city in the northern part of the Netherlands. And we are with about 150 researchers and 105 companies. And since I'm the founder, I also have a very big influence on the mission of Wetsus. And we have as a mission to work only on innovations that will lead to a fair and sustainable society. So the question will be, what will be your mission with your innovations in the future? Let me first introduce you two global problems from a long list of problems, of course, that humanity is facing. In the first place, water scarcity. It is estimated that about It is estimated that about 4 billion people are affected by water scarcity. And in this graph, you can see how many months per year people are affected. But of course, 1 month seems to be a little, but if the 1 month is typically in the months that you needed the water for your crops, then it will be a very big impact anyhow. So the majority of the water is used for agriculture, and especially within agriculture for animal feed. But what we see is that humanity is using about 15% too much water at this moment. And the water use is still growing. So what does it look like that we use too much water? So, do again. So here you see, for instance, the Aral Lake in Siberia, which is a very famous example of how the water of an entire lake was used to grow cotton. This is surface water, because there are also rivers that are depleted of water with an enormous impact, of course, on nature. But there are also very big aquifers in the world, like the Ogala aquifer in the USA. But also in China and India, you have these very big aquifers. These aquifers were filled over. He's doing it automatically. These aquifers are filled over hundreds of thousands of years, and we are now depleting them in about 100 years. So also this Ogala aquifer is also already depleted somewhere around 50%. The other global problem I would like to address is the world zinc deficiency. Here you can also see this is a global problem. In all areas of the world, there are areas without any zinc. And it's especially a problem because all the zinc reserves we have in the world at this moment are going to be depleted within 20 years. Zinc is essential for growth, for plant growth. And if you are in a zinc deficient area, soil, you can increase your plant growth with more than 600% if you would bring the zinc level up to optimal conditions. And of course, you would save a lot of water with that, because with the same amount of water now, you can produce 6 times more crops. But it's also essential for the human immune system. And it's not, I have no estimation how many people in the world are affected by zinc shortage, but it is estimated that about 800,000 people per year die of zinc shortage. So it is an enormous problem. At this moment in the world, thanks to the innovations of the past, we have a specialized agriculture. That means you have very large areas of land where crops are grown, like soya and grains, and you have much smaller areas where people and animals are concentrating. And also in these smaller areas, you will have the food processing industry. So what will happen is that crops are transported from the crop areas into these hotspots. And the nutrients that are in these crops are accumulating in these hotspots. And of course, these hotspots have enormous problems with nitrogen and phosphorus pollution, but also the zinc is accumulating here. And like I said, zinc is probably the most urgent mineral that's going to be depleted. But also what we call virtual water is accumulating here. So if you grow a ton of grain, you have used about 1,000 tons of water. So if you export a ton of grain, you virtually export 1,000 tons of water. So also a lot of water is accumulated here. So this is a very big problem. We call them wicked problems because it's not completely clear how we should solve them. But let's think about that. There's this famous graph of exponential growth, like population grows exponential, but also the wealth of the population grows exponential. And exponential growth always leads to discontinuity. At a certain point, we will break the limits, like, for instance, that the zinc will be depleted in 20 years. But of course, in the past, this has been talked about several times that this would happen, and in the end, it never happens. Like, for instance, Malthus, this very famous guy from 1800, he predicted that there would be an enormous food shortage, and in the end, it never happened because we were innovating. And then you get a graph like this. So every time when it seems we are going into discontinuity, there is an innovation that postpones this discontinuity. But what you see is that these innovations in a world that grows in number of people and grows in economic growth, that these innovations have to be faster and faster and faster. And we are still going in the direction of discontinuity. So innovations alone are not enough. And that's the title of my presentation. We should search for coherent innovations, innovations that make the society whole with the evolution and not disturbing it any further. So let's look at, if we talk about innovations, what policymakers think about. They always think about high tech, money making, unicorn startups that make a lot of money, but are those the kind of innovations that we need? So if you look at, for instance, the United States, we have the Boston Innovation District. All policymakers in the world are jealous about that because it's probably, in money-wise, it's the highest hotspot in innovation in the world. But if you look at the companies that are located there, then you see that these companies are mainly pharmaceuticals, financials, and ICT monopolies. And these three kinds of companies are exactly the companies that Mariana Mazzucato, in her book, The Value of Everything, accuses of extracting value from society instead of investing value in society. So therefore, I'm very proud that KAUST, a new university in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, decided to focus on water, food, energy, and environment, because those things are the basis of society. So there are problems with innovations. One innovation of the Green Revolution is that we use much more pesticides. And now it's clear that neurologists warn us for a Parkinson pandemic from exposure to pesticides. And it's now proven that this area in your brain, the substana nigra, is attacked by pesticides, and they can show it very clearly in mice which pesticides are responsible for that. So continuing with this kind of pesticides in the end will hurt us more than it will benefit us. The other thing is the medicines. In countries with rivers where we put the sewage water into the rivers, we see that downstream of these sewage discharge points, that the fish become infertile. They will have both male and female organs, so they cannot make any babies anymore. And this, of course, is a very big problem, because then these kind of fishes are dying out. So if you then would say this search for coherence, how would it look like? Well, that's not clear. That's also one of the things that you could work on in your career, because we do not know what innovations will do in 20 to 30 years in many cases. But it is clear that the medicine system, so as like we have at this moment, is not going to be coherent. At this moment, 10 million of the Dutch people are chronically using medicines, and we only have 17 million people living in the Netherlands. So that means that more than half of the people is chronically ill, while we live in one of the richest and healthiest countries in the world. So it seems that something goes wrong. And is it not much more coherent to work on lifestyle and healthy food and take care that the food is pesticide-free and contains all the nutrients that we need? The second one, example is the pesticides. Well, I already described that. Can we not reduce the amount of pesticides by increasing the soil health again and improving the soil organisms in the soil? The other one is the PFAS. Maybe you've heard of that. It's the fluoride compounds that seems to be chemicals forever. If they go into nature, they will not break down. In the Western world, almost everyone has PFAS in his blood now, and it's in the soil and everywhere. And we are still producing it. It's also, because it's in our clothes, it's also in our sewer treatment plants. And because of that, the sludge of sewer treatment plants is now too dangerous to use in agriculture. But if you don't use the sludge in agriculture, then we create a non-circular system, which is especially important for zinc. So the food goes into a city, people eat the food, then the nutrients go into the toilet, into the sewer system. The sewer system goes into the wastewater treatment plant, and there the nutrients are collected in the sludge. But this sludge is now too dangerous to use in agriculture, so the sludge is burned in almost the entire Europe. So wastewater is a dead end for nutrients. So the zinc, that is where 800,000 people die of in the world, in the rich countries, is concentrated in the sludge and then burned and then disposed of as chemical waste. And it wasn't like this in the past. In the past, the sludge was reused in agriculture. But for instance, in the Netherlands, this completely stopped since the year 2000 and was already very small at that time. Now all the sludge is incinerated or used in concrete production. So wouldn't it not be an interesting coherent innovation if we could separate the feces and urine from the rest of the wastewater? Because the things that happen in the toilets seem to be still kind of pure and unpolluted, except of course from some medicines, but that we have to take care of with lifestyle. So we keep the feces and urine separate from the wastewater, with disconnecting the sewer toilets from the sewer and make two sewers, one for the what we call the black water and one for the gray water. So in the black water contains the feces and the urine, and the gray water contains the rest. And then if you look at this graph, this is the amount of water a European person would use. And you see that the feces and urine is only like 1% of this water. And at this moment, with the flush water, we increase that by 30%. And then we mix it with the gray water. And then on top of that comes the rainwater. And then we have made a mixture that cannot be used for agriculture anymore. So we propose to use vacuum toilets that we know from airplanes that use almost no water to make this separated toilet water even more concentrated. So we call that concentrated black water. Not only can we secure the nutrients then, but we also save an enormous amount of water. If you compare the Netherlands, and which is, I'd say, comparable with Europe, we use about 37 liters per day per person to flush the toilet. For Americans, this will be 70 liters per day per person. If you use a vacuum toilet, you will use less than 4 liters per day per person. So you would save about 30 to 35 liters in Europe per day per person, and in the United States, about 70 liters. So this is humongous. So I'm not sure the toilets in the kingdom, but I think they look a little bit more like the American toilets than the European toilets. So imagine how much water you could save that does not have to be desalinated and does not have to be reused because you didn't use it in the first place. We have built a pilot plant with these vacuum toilets. It's a whole division in a city in the Netherlands, the city of Sneek, and about 200 houses are connected to this. All these houses have vacuum toilets, and then we have a special sewer system that brings this water into the treatment plant, and we can indeed produce very pure sludge that is very high in zinc concentration. So now we stop sharing. So this zinc can be recovered now from clean sludge. So if we use this sludge in agriculture, then it can be saved from being discharged as chemical waste. So this would be a way to become more circular with nutrients that are going to be depleted in 20 years. So it's not only about technology, it's also about the mentality of the rich world. At this moment, it seems that the rich societies have only two objectives. One is striving for longer living, striving for immortality, and in doing that, taking up more and more of the economy. If you look at life expectancy, the life expectancy by water sanitation has been improved by 30 years, and the water sanitation is about 1 to 2% of an economy. If you look at the care and cure system of the Western world, it's almost about 15%. And that saves about 1 to 2 years of life expectancy. So you can ask yourself and you can imagine that the care and cure economy in the rich countries is one of the most polluting now that we have. because of all the medicines, the radioactivity, all the plastic they use, the CO2 they emit. So this fear of life, there we try to expand our lives with a few months. Is it really worth all this pollution? And is it fair to future societies to make such debts to keep this care system going? And the other objective is luxury, always more luxury. And it's becoming more and more clear that more luxury is not leading to more purpose in life. It's not leading to more happiness. It even seems so that in the richer world, this lack of purpose is even more severe than in the poor side of the world. So this leads to a European water footprint of something like 4,000 liters per day. And this water footprint, you have to think of everything that you eat, but also all the industrial products. But you see that the majority of the footprint is going to food production, and a lot of that is imported, like tea and coffee and chocolate and nuts. It's all imported into Europe. But also the cattle feed, the majority of the water goes to milk and meat. So this is the average footprint. The average American footprint is even bigger. It's 7,000 liters per day. And if you calculate, we would have been with 10 billion people on Earth, what would be a fair footprint? Then we come to something like 2,300 liters per day. So it's clear that Europeans and Americans are too high. They are using too much. So this needs something else than innovations. This also needs something like personal leadership. It also be calculated by a large group of scientists that worked on it for several years, what would be a fair diet if we are with 10 billion people. Fair and sustainable, so that it will not, because agriculture, it's clear, is putting a large demand on sustainability. And they came to the conclusion that I will not discuss the whole diet, but for meat, that you can eat 2 times meat per day if you want to have a fair diet. 1 time red meat and 1 time white meat. So now we can start sharing again, please. If you look to the literature, what has caused societies to collapse in the past, it's very interesting that some societies did not collapse. And a very famous example from that is from the Book of Diamond. And he compares the Vikings from Greenland with the Vikings from Iceland. And the Vikings from Greenland did not survive, and the Vikings from Iceland did. And you can kind of select some higher values, because that's what we need as a society. And one higher value is future orientation. So if you only want to live for the day, then you will not, a society will not survive. Well, in the Netherlands, where we live in a harsh society too, because we are below sea level, our future orientation is that our dikes that protect us against the sea have been built for flooding for once every 100,000 years. And if you compare that with the US, where the dikes are built for a flooding every 100 years. The other one is community spirit. So if you want to do everything on your own and don't share with strangers, your society is more at risk than if you can do big things together. Like building dikes in the past, all community has to cooperate with that. And if there is only one piece of dike missing, of course, the whole dike wouldn't work. And finally, is world perspective. That's something of the last 100 years, that we should realize that if we use spuitbussen, wat zijn dat? Ja. Spuitbussen, wat zijn spuitbussen? I don't know the English word at the moment. So if you use this CFKs for deodorants and things like that, that you will make a hole in the ozone layer in Australia. So that's for a Dutch person, interesting world perspective, that it's good to stop with that to save the ozone layer on the other side of the world. So these three higher values are crucial for a more environmental future. And there's one more aspect I want to give you, and that's the culture war we are in at this moment. And that seems to be becoming more and more urgent, so also for your careers. And according to the philosopher Ken Wilber, this culture war, you can see three groups. It's the traditional groups. Well, let's start with the modern one. The modern one is the biggest. It's about 50%. And they are the people that believe that science has all the answers, that we have to follow the science and to find answers to the dilemmas that we have. They are also very much oriented on achievements. And of course, you will have a world with winners and losers. Then you have the traditional ones, that people that think that their own group is more important. So that could be religion, it could be nationalities, it could be soccer teams, and that people want to sacrifice themselves for the groups. They are not very individualistic, and they are more traditional. And it's clear that they have more difficulty of trusting people outside the group. And finally, you have the postmodern group, more what we call in the Western world, we call the woke group. They believe in total equality of both ideas and people, and they don't see any hierarchy whatsoever. It is clear that these three groups are now fighting with each other, and this fight is being fired up by the social media very much. And in the United States, you can see that it's already becoming pretty severe. So it's very important to realize, especially for the modern people, where most of us probably belong to since we are scientists, that it's not possible to convince the other groups. And Ken Wilber says it's a consciousness-based idea. So it's based on consciousness, and every person in growth of consciousness has to go through these three phases. And so it's more a matter of inclusivity than convincing. And then he says, if you would see this as consciousness levels, then the next consciousness level is the integral level, where you don't want to fight the other groups anymore. So for young people like you, it's very interesting not to fight against the other groups, but to see if you can find things in the other groups that you also agree with, so that you can think integral about this culture war and bring everybody further. So, like I said, the future not only depends on innovations, but also the kind of innovations that we are going to make. So also on the personal leadership of you. So I would start with eat meat like a lion. A lion is an animal that is 100% specialized in digestion of meat. When it catches a prey, it eats the prey for 4 days, and then it fasts for 6 days to completely digest the meat. We humans don't have a 100% digestion system for meat. We should learn from the lion. It's much healthier to eat 6 days no meat. And then we would exactly be on the fair diet I mentioned before. Healthier and more sustainable. The second thing is, in a world that always wants more, it's impossible to save the environment. So determine as young as possible what is enough for you. What kind of level of wealth do you want to reach? It's not the same for everyone. But don't go on wanting more and more your entire life. And finally, create a purpose. It doesn't matter what, but help your family or help the world or do something good. If you look at environmental sciences, they would say you can divide the world in 3 groups. The first group is the good leaders. I call them the sons. The second group are the followers. They are the biggest, and they are about 60%. And I call them the moons. And the leaders should realize that a moon can only give light when a sun gives light on the moon. So the the responsibility of good leaders, people like you, is very big in this world. We cannot be narcissistic and think that you're not good enough, but you must radiate to other people and be a light. Finally, there are also evil people. You can call them black holes. And you could imagine if you have followers, they also can find followers. So that even increases the responsibility of the leaders to be a light in the world. This result of leadership can be very big. For instance, I always like to show this slide, the landscape restoration of the Loess Plateau of China. This is a reforestation of the size of France. It was a desert, and now it's completely green again with small rivers in it. And this is the result of leadership, to do this. And you can imagine for yourself, for all the innovations that you work on, are they coherent or are they not coherent? Should we spend billions of euros, like we are planning now in the Netherlands, on CO2 storage under the sea? Or should we use that money to create new trees in deserts? Wouldn't that be much fairer for the poor people that live there? So we at Wetsus are now working on a fantastic project, and it's the regreening of the Sini. And of course, many people would say that's impossible, but all new innovations are ridiculed. So it's just a matter of courage to continue with it. So we are with a group of companies and persons that are now making meteorological models and ways to think of how we could realize this. The hypothesis behind it, that if the forest would be there, it would create its own rain. And there are many hypotheses already in the scientific world how this would work. Of course, they are not all the same, but it's also very interesting to see which one will work. And another thing, what's very important if you want to restore deteriorated agricultural lands, is to restore the soil. And we at this moment do a lot of research. Is what if you see on the left, you see burnt soil, then you have just dust. And if you put a little bit of bacteria in there with a little bit of food, and then within no time, the structure of the soil is back. And we have proven that this is due to the EPS that's in the soil granule. And EPS is a polymer that bacteria can make. So if you want to improve soil, you should give the bacteria in the soil something to eat that can make APS of. It is also very interesting for regreening deserts is that the microbiome of the soil can increase plant growth. So now we have done experiments that if you would inoculate soil with soil from a forest, the small trees in your lab will grow about 30 to 50% faster than if you don't inoculate them with soil from a forest. So this kind of insights, in my opinion, are very coherent innovations. So the question is, can we create a coherent world? A world where we stop with the exponential growth and where we make innovations that create a world that we ourselves want to live in. That will be the challenge for your generation. So my call for you will be radiating, be a light, and be integral. Connect the people in the culture wars together. That will be very important for our future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Cees. We do have questions. Again, as per usual, if you have questions for the in-person attendees, there are 2 standing mics that you can go to and ask your questions. But let me start off with some of the questions. We do have quite a lot of questions from the online attendees. So I'm just going to maybe start off with the first question that has the highest vote. So as the executive board member of Wetsus, can you share a little bit about, like, for instance, what are some of the decision making process that goes towards which kind of innovations to focus on that can lead to a fair and sustainable world? I mean, after all, there's a lot of innovations and technological breakthroughs. So how do you then assess which innovation to perhaps go forward with that can lead to a more equitable, fair, and sustainable future?
Yes, well, that's a very good question, and it's also the heart of the whole matter, and that's why I called my presentation today the search for coherence, because we are not, of course, in many cases we are not sure what will be the fate of an innovation. But in the water world, of course, we already have a lot of experience of innovations that went wrong or well in the past. And with the water world, we always have a serving attitude to society. But it's clear that cleaning the water and then polluting the soil or polluting the air, which we did in the past, is something that's not coherent. And cleaning the water and then making waste that we cannot do anything with is not coherent. So I would say we need to continue with innovations, especially for the circular economy, that all our wastewater can be reused again. So that's something we are looking for. So the innovations that will not lead to wastewater that can be reused again would be then something that we do not consider. And the same thing is for desalination. So there are some problems with desalination. So we are now looking, can we make a desalination system that is completely brine-free? Or can we make a desalination system that is completely chemical-free? Mm-hmm. So it remains a search that must be emphasized.
So in other words, basically, if I were to interpret what you just said, is that there is a need when we consider innovations, when we come out with new innovations, that there's a need to consider that it should be coherent, not just within one particular sector, for instance, water or wastewater. It needs to also consider its connection to other areas, maybe energy, maybe nutrients, how it's going to impact the environment, and to consider the whole spectrum to really to say that innovation is something that's worth pushing for. It's not supposedly something that's just restricted to one particular sector alone. Okay.
Yes.
Yep. So.
And I can maybe add one more thing, and that one of the big threats, at least in the rich world, is that we slowly, but certainly are toxifying ourselves and our environment completely. I already mentioned PFAS and pesticides, but slowly but certainly it's everywhere. So how to stop that in the water sector, of course, is a very big carrier of sustainability. So if we can keep the chemicals out of the water or clean the water in such a way that it's completely chemical-free and don't use chemicals ourselves anymore, that would be one of our aims.
Right. And so immediately we do have one comment, which is talking about the fact that we're discussing about the need for discovery of coherent innovations. So most of the times as scientists or inventors or engineers, we will feel that, okay, yes, perhaps we do have some coherent innovation that's worth pushing, but it's very hard to perhaps enter into the market or really translate it, because we might not have the buy-in from the different stakeholders, maybe policy makers or commercial sectors, to really translate that potential innovation to make an impact in society. So in your opinion, how should we be bridging this gap?
Yeah, of course, this is important. But it's also something about vision and personal leadership. So if nobody works on these innovations, they will never be used. If these innovations at a certain moment will become an alternative to society, then maybe some policymakers will use it, and then there will be a start of somewhere where somebody is demonstrating it. And then slowly but certainly, this could expand. And yeah, and you see that the policymakers change their mind all the time. So at this moment, enormous investment will be done in CO2 problems. Mm-hmm. So that was unthinkable 10 years ago. And so if you have the innovations ready, and when the policymakers are ready for it, then you can use them. Right. So it is if you innovate, you always have to convince others to use it.
Yeah, which again reminds me of a quote that Mr. Nadmi, our interim vice president for CAUS, mentioned yesterday. If you believe in your vision, or maybe if you believe in the vision of the technology that you are pushing through, just go ahead and do it. Who knows when the opportunities will come and somebody will believe in the vision that you are developing as well. So who knows? Just go ahead and do it. So
exactly.
Right. And I guess one particular question that may be a bit debatable, or maybe something that we can kind of very similar to what we are discussing right now, is that luxury and striving for profits is a problem, but at the same time, innovations will most likely be delivered for those for profit startups and companies with stakeholders that have monetary interests. So what he's trying to say is that usually innovations need to come with dollars and cents in order to get stakeholders to be interested, right? At least that's how the current system, the financial system, is working. So do you think innovations without for-profit incentives are actually possible? Or are we operating in a society where everything is about dollars and cents?
I would say that 90% of innovations in the water world are not coming through the financial sector, and they are done through private investments, families, small companies. And so I would not worry too much about that, because the big money in the world is not so very much interested in water anyhow, in the environment anyhow. They go to the other sectors I already mentioned. So there are always people that are interested. There are always people that can be inspired by a better future. So don't get discouraged by uninspiring financial people.
Yeah. Perhaps the path will be a bit harder, especially I think sometimes when people think about water, they think about it as a public commodity. You cannot privatize it too much, because then you deprive people for the water, you deprive people the water. So when you have innovations that's related to water and wastewater, sometimes it's a little bit harder to convince people to buy in the technology, because they think that these technologies should be provided for free as a public commodity, but then it impedes innovations and change in the infrastructure systems. So I think a good balance between working for public commodity and privatization is very, very important in order to advance certain technological innovations. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, and there is always this cooperation, because the technological companies many times are private, and the end users many times are public. So there is already this cooperation. And we did research that in the water sector, it takes about 10 to 15 years before new innovations are accepted, if they are, of course, if they were beneficial innovations. So it's also, it is really a business that you should be engaged for, because it's not a big money business. But I think working with inspiring people is always easier than working with financial people.
Yeah, I agree. Well, maybe eventually I have to disagree. Well, anyway, currently I agree. So one thing is about the way the current infrastructure is established. So you mentioned just now in your presentation that a lot of the infrastructure in the developed countries, in the mature countries, actually leads to a lot of wastage, with the US as an example, for instance. So if a lot of the current infrastructure is leading to so much wastage without any significant improvement in the quality of life, what is hindering those governments to change the infrastructure?
So I could not completely hear your question, but your question is,
so,
how can we...
Yeah, so just now in your presentation, you've mentioned that there's actually a lot of the existing infrastructure, using the example of the toilets. They are leading to a huge amount of wastage in terms of water, for instance. So, and as there's actually no significant improvement in the quality of life. So if the current infrastructure is leading to so much wastage, what is hindering the current government, whatever is hindering the government across the different countries in the world to change the infrastructure to lead to less wastage? Why are they not doing something about it?
So I could not completely hear your question, but your question is, how can we...
So, yeah, so just now in your presentation, you've mentioned that there's actually a lot of the existing infrastructure, using the example of the toilets. They are leading to a huge amount of wastage in terms of water, for instance. So if the current infrastructure is leading to so much wastage, what is hindering the current government,
Yeah, well, it's clear that the existing sewer systems it's going to cost billions to solve that. But in the Netherlands, for instance, we are now planning to build 1 million new houses. So it would be fantastic to switch to the new system. Of course, all the wastewater treatment plants are already there, and they have a depreciation time of 50 years. So there is a kind of a slowness in depreciation that is stopping this. Mm-hmm. But then, on the other hand, there are many very fast-growing cities in the rest of the world that are now kind of following our systems with the sewers, that could change their mind and build their own system. Like Neom, it's a city that's going to be completely freshly built. Look at the enormous amount of water that Neom could save if they would introduce from the beginning this double sewer system with vacuum toilets.
Right. But in the case of, for instance, Netherlands, you've mentioned multiple times Netherlands, and Netherlands is definitely a very good example for anyone working on the water and wastewater technology and stuff. So I'm aware that Netherlands really sets a lot of the classic case examples on how to privatize the wastewater sector, for instance. And because I'm aware that resource recovery from waste streams have been ongoing in the Netherlands, but unfortunately, the progress has been pretty slow in other regions like Asia and Middle East. So can you share a little bit more about, from the perspective of the Netherlands, how do they actually achieve such high acceptance and take-up rates across the different stakeholders? And from those examples, what can the other regions learn in order to make people see that the waste streams are actually not waste, but a resource center?
Well, in the Netherlands, the drinking water and the sewage water is 100% publicly treated, so it's not private. Like I said, I think this is a matter of higher values. In the Netherlands, we are very much future-oriented, and we see that the future without circular economy is going to give enormous problems. And you already see now all kinds of shortages in the world. So at this moment, there is this enormous shortage of natural gas in the Netherlands. And because we used to be the rich part of the world, but slowly but certainly, other parts of the world become rich too. So we have to share much more. So if we do not make our economy circular, there will be a shortage of everything in the future. So that's in the first thing. The second thing, the Netherlands is very small, and we simply cannot dispose of all the waste on our territory, but that is obligated by the EU. So if you reuse waste, you don't have to discharge it. You can simply reuse it, and it will take no service. So that's why the Netherlands. You must also realize that per square kilometer we have about the most amount of people, the most amount of animals, and the highest amount of traffic in the world. So we are also one of the most polluted countries in the world. And therefore, environment is very high on our mind to solve. And like I said in the beginning, making more waste is impossible in our country.
Right. But in the case of the success of the Netherlands, because you mentioned and you emphasized the fact that the water and the wastewater treatment processes and the utilities, they are actually not private. They are not privatized, but a public utility. In that case, do I interpret it as it should be more of like it should be started by the governments to identify that it's vitally important that any growth in society needs to take into consideration of environmental protection in order to continue a sustained growth of the economy of the country, and then create that environment for subsequent innovations to generate revenues out of this whole process. Would that be a good approach for developing countries, or maybe governments of developing countries, to consider as they move forward in water and wastewater sector, for instance?
Yes, I think if the government would lead a country to a society where we want to live in, that would be fantastic. But what you see in the Western countries is that the governments are changing their mind all the time. Therefore, it's also very important that there is individual leadership, that we have. If you look at the research we did about innovations that became successful in the water sector, you can see there were many innovations that were already there when they were having almost no business. And then all of a sudden, the government changes their mind to solve some kind of problem. And then these innovations became very successful. But the innovators already took the risk to develop these innovations before this market was there. It was just the vision that this market would someday be there. And so it would be fantastic if you have government with vision, because that of course will speed up everything enormously. But if there is a government with changing vision, then it's up to the individual innovators to have the vision themselves.
Right, yes. So in one of the slides that you've also mentioned just now was about the greening in Sinai, which is in Egypt. And so is that an ongoing project that you are involved in the greening of the desert area in Sinai?
Yes, that is one of the research topics of Wetsus. And we are making a meteorological model. And it's very interesting that if the forest would be there, then probably there was water enough. But now there is no water. So how can you go from, so 5,000 years ago there was a forest. So how can you go back to that situation? Because in the Netherlands, if you cut the forest and you do nothing, then within 30 years it's forest again. But in the Sinai, if you cut the forest, then it never becomes a forest again. So how can we change that situation? And we're looking at to integrate technical solutions with environmental solutions. And that's a very exciting topic. And big dredging companies are connected to this topic, and because they believe they have the size and the power to really do it, to really make it happen. And so we're working with the dredging company Dame from Belgium, and they are in close contact with the Egyptian government about this plan. So we hope very soon to go to the next phase in this plan.
I see. Do you know anything about the technology that they are proposing to do this massive forestation in that particular area? I mean, like, is it trying to tap into more groundwater, or is it more of recycled water, or what? I mean, like, is it the technologies to provide water to grow that large-scale forest that is modeled and shown just now?
Yeah. So the question is, how much water would you need until the whole system becomes self-sufficient?
Yes.
And can we do that in the most natural way possible? Because if you start desalination, things like that, probably it will be too expensive. And can you do it in phases so that you can start with a small forest and it slowly becomes bigger? So that kind of things we are investigating at this moment. And also, what's very important is how should the soil be improved before it's ready to grow a forest in the first place. So yes.
So it's more of the starting from a smaller scale and then hoping that the forest will extend by itself over with time.
Yes, there are these two hypotheses. One is that if you would have more water in the air, then automatically you would get rain because you will get you will pass the condensation point. That at this moment will never happen because the Sinai is too hot and the water evaporating from the Mediterranean Sea, so it will never reach its condensation point. So that's one. And the other one is that if you have forests, then you create hotter areas, especially at night. Then you get connection with higher air layers, atmosphere layers, and then automatically you will get rain. So that's completely different theories. We are looking into that now. What would be if you would have to try them both or start with one or things like that? It's also depending, of course, about how much momentum the Egyptian government is going to put on this topic.
Yes. So on a related note, we all know that the Middle East region is particularly water stressed, and yet the demands for food, energy, and of course water by itself, and also with all these massive greening efforts that is gaining momentum in recent years, they are continue to grow exponentially. So bearing in mind that the region is particularly water stressed, what kind of key innovations do you think will be particularly promising to enhance water resilience within this region without compromising food, energy, and enhanced livability?
Yeah, of course. I think that will be the $1,000 million question: how to solve water problems in the desert. And interestingly, the Netherlands is a country where we throw away about 90% of our fresh water into the sea, and this also very it's blown our minds how to live in the desert. Well, I think what is incredibly important is that your soil becomes as water resilient as possible, and that is the first start, because else you would waste an enormous amount of water. You have to be future oriented, that you will not spoil your groundwater reserves to the wrong things. And in your case, you will have to desalinate, and I would say to develop desalination systems that having no impact on the environment is very important. And I saw from the Water Center last year some ideas to make them completely sun-driven. Well, that would be, of course, fantastic in a country like Saudi Arabia with so much sun. But things like that would be very much of my interest, and also what I just described: use vacuum toilets and reuse, because then the water reuse will be much easier, because the grey water does not contain the nutrients, does not contain any pathogenic bacteria anymore, because they are all in the black water. And then the reuse of the water becomes much easier and much less burdened with a bad marketing point of view.
Right. So desalination and wastewater treatment and reuse is definitely two key innovations that need to further develop, bearing in mind also the energy and the carbon emissions that it can be associated with, because just with the traditional or conventional desalination and wastewater treatment process perhaps is no longer sufficient. It has to bear in mind, it also has to consider how much energy does it need, how much carbon is it emitting, as to again relate back to what you've mentioned just now in terms of the search for coherent innovations. So perhaps
yes. And if we solve the Sini problem, then you maybe can also use it in Saudi Arabia.
Right. Well, yes, perhaps. So maybe the last comment before we end today's session, because I think it might be a very good one to encourage students, is that how do you put innovation solutions into practice? How do you balance innovation cost and profits in the real world? Because I think this is all something that perhaps as students have a technology and they want to bring it to the next level, it's something that maybe they will meet a lot of rejections along the way. How do you, I mean, what kind of advice would you tell them to consider when it comes to innovations, costs, profits, so as to make them know whether it's something that perhaps is going to be a bit harder, but might be still worthwhile?
Well, in our search for, in our study to what innovations are successful, it was clear that there are two kinds of innovations. We call them the crisis innovations, that you were lucky to have an innovation ready when the government changed its mind about something, and then you could immediately sell it. And the other one are the value-driven innovations. And that means that you can improve on something that's already there. But in the water sector, people are very risk reluctant. So that means that any innovation, especially the value-based innovations, they must at least be 50% better than existing innovations, or else nobody will be interested. And so that's something to remember. The second thing is that if you are working on real new things, I always say you have a phase to go from nothing to something, and a phase to go from something to more. And it's not the same kind of people that can do that. But if you go from nothing to something, so that is the biggest innovations, then you will always be ridiculed. So you must have a thick skin to be able to resist ridiculization. In Wetsus, we say all the innovations that were never ridiculed are not real innovations. And finally, you see in the world, there are people that are very good in research, but have no clue about innovations. There are people that are very good in sales, but have no clue about research. And if you make a salesperson the head of your innovation department, nothing will happen. If you make because he only talks about the market-driven and things like that. If you have a researcher head of your innovation division, nothing happens either, because he always wants to improve and do fundamental research and never go anywhere. What you need is people that have the skill to connect those people. And to see the chances innovation have based on new innovations and based on what the market could use. Because if it was only market-driven, it's so easy. And then you simply convert lead into gold. So if you ever, as an innovator, talk to a salesperson who says you have to be market-driven, then you simply answer him, well, then we're going to change lead into gold, because that's a fantastic business. But it's clear then that's not possible. So that it also, any innovation also has to be dependent on something that's possible. And so if you are a researcher, you want to innovate, look for somebody who can make this connection. And if you are a salesperson who wants to innovate, look for somebody who can make the connection with research. So those are the three advices I would have.
Thank you very much. Basically, it's a teamwork, not an individual work.
Many cases, yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Cees. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you, Professor Buisman. Thank you.